One of the hardest things about dealing with religious trauma and spiritual abuse is the loss of identity. The loss of identity, man, it's heartbreaking. Who am I outside of the church building? Who am I outside of this organization?
Church structures get a lot of free labor from people in the name of, well, you're serving God. Going all in means you serve the church. That's another one of these like corporate church structure things that we have to really think about.
They sacrifice people on the altar of ministry. They sacrifice
100%.
people on the altar of progress or the bottom line.
It's not a pastoral relationship. It's an employee relationship. And once that employee is terminated via their volunteerism, that pastoral ministry is gone. So it was never really about ultimately, I care about you as a human. It becomes, I care about you as long as you're valuable to the work of the church.
You only have time to keep the machine going, because if you don't keep the machine going and things don't grow, you lose your job. You said, man, I was drumming. I loved worship drumming, and a lot of my identity was as a worship drummer at the time. And that's something that I hear that I think it makes, whether someone's just leaving a church, whether they're leaving the faith tradition, whether they still believe in Jesus but are struggling to go to a church, or they're fully deconstructing. One of the hardest things about dealing with religious trauma and spiritual abuse is the loss of identity. So you got the loss of community. We've already talked about the loss of identity. Man, it's heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. But a lot of that comes from, I feel like we're inadvertently being taught to place our identity in these systems and place our identity in these roles, and these volunteer roles, instead of placing our identity in Christ. How do you see that the church has done that? Where are we doing that, whether it's on purpose or on accident? And what can we do to fix that, where to make positive changes where we're not teaching people or helping them to put their identity in things instead of who they are, and instead of their faith in general?
Well, I have a hard time separating the two sometimes. In my experience in my church traditions, I was always taught that my identity is in Christ, and that looked like what I did for the church. That was kind of the fruit of that identity. Right. So they were kind of always intertwined, which honestly, like, I want to be clear. I was not abused at my church. I really wasn't. I had a very positive church experiences, and I gladly volunteered my time as a drummer to play. Like, I loved it. It was very much a consensual thing. And my youth worship pastor at the time was like, "Hey man, I want to make sure you don't burn out. I'm going to take you off the schedule for a few weeks." Like, that's how he thought about it. So, I did not have
that's good.
a traumatic. Oh yeah, it was totally good. But what happens is, and I'm not sure this is even necessarily a bad thing, because we all have identities. I mean, we all wear multiple identities, right? To my kids, I'm dad. To my wife, I'm a husband. To my social media people that I talk with, I'm Tim from TNE, right? To my cover band, I'm the drummer. So we all in society and in life wear different hats to different people. I don't think that that's a bad thing. It's just kind of how things are structured in our current historical moment. I think what happens is that, at least for me, I really merge this idea of like, okay, I am a Jesus follower. What's my role in the kingdom? What's my calling in the kingdom? And for a long time, it was a lot of things, but it was really this drumming idea of like, part of my job is that when I'm leading these worship spaces, we're helping people break free of these spiritual strongholds, and we're ushering the presence of God in a very unique way. Because one of my problems with worship culture that I've always had is we unintentionally create this dualism that like God is here now, but not when you go back home, right? And that's just not true. Like the presence of God is everywhere that we go. However, I think that God can meet people in unique ways depending on the environment, and music has a very unique way of doing that. So I don't know, like, it's tricky, because I get what you're saying completely, of course, and I empathize with that 100%. But also, like, the question I ask is, well, what does that identity in Christ look like fleshed out? And to me, people have all different sub-identities that kind of flow into, as a Christ follower, I'm a pastor. As a Christ follower, I love doing greeting. As a Christ follower, I love being the janitor. So I'm not really sure if that's inherently problematic, but I think the issue is when that gets taken away, right? When you find the boundary of evangelicalism, not of Christianity, of evangelicalism, and they say, sorry, you found a boundary, and you go, you know what? I have to be true to what I know. I have to kind of hold a different take on this belief. And they go, sorry, you're out. Then that structure that supports that identity is totally stripped away. And then you're left really thinking, well, who ever was I? Like, what was I doing for all those years?
For sure.
And that's very anxiety inducing for sure.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting because you shared more of your story there and about how you had a worship pastor that was being very careful not to burn you out. That's not what a lot of worship volunteers, I hear from are experiencing.
Totally.
One of the things that we're looking at, and again, I do business consulting, church consulting, all the like when you look at where a person volunteers in a church, in big modern evangelical mega churches, so it's just a subset, but it's a good subset to look at. The average person who's volunteering averages volunteering in 2.5 to 3.5 different roles.
Wow.
Right. So when you think about the time that takes to do those roles well, and if you're doing those things well, the people who are giving the most are the ones who are asked to fill in all the gaps. We've run into a lot of people who their story is, I was basically spending all of my time at the church, volunteering at the church all the time. So many of these sub identities, including even who I was as a husband or as a father, because my kids were wrapped up in that. So many of those sub identities hit the floor at one time that I really had this question of who am I outside of the church building? Who am I outside of this organization? And that's where I've seen it become so damaging. So now I think you made a good point though. It's not inherently wrong to have a part of your identity in the things you do. Where it becomes wrong is when it's overused or when you have too much of your identity, in those things.
I would say it becomes dangerous then, right? Because to your point, like, and this is maybe a different layer to it, but there is something to say about how megachurch structures get a lot of free labor from people in the name of, you're serving God. And I don't want to cast negative intention on all those people. In fact, I have a very good friend who's a mega church pastor, one of the largest churches in the U.S., and we talk a lot about this, and we agree on a lot. We disagree on mega church structure, of course, right?
Yeah.
But there is something to this narrative that to be a faithful Christ follower means going all in. Going all in means you serve the church, right? Like that can be the case, but this notion that if you're not serving at your church, you're not taking your faith seriously, isn't really the most thoughtful, I think, way of approaching it, because some folks might want to volunteer, but other folks might be volunteering in their soup kitchen, or might just be busy with raising kids, right? Which we have 2 under 4. It's a lot. So I do think
for
you're
you,
right.
Man. That's a tough season.
Yeah, a tough season.
Fun season, but a tough season.
It is a complicated season. It's a good season overall. But no, I tend to agree with you on that. I think that that's another one of these like corporate church structure things that we have to really think about, is like, why so much focus and dependency on the volunteer world, right? Where, to your point, many of these volunteers get burnt out. They give everything. And then once they shift their faith a little bit, or they come to a different conclusion about a question, all of a sudden, hey, thanks for all of your labor and time, but you believe something that we just can't hold to anymore, so you got to go. And that to me is when things get really problematic.
Yeah. Well, and I can tell you, and we're not scared to wade into this, because this is very much so kind of where we live, the systems and structures and things that lead to abuse and religious trauma, the structures that need to get out of the church, because really they sacrifice people on the altar of ministry. They sacrifice 100%. People on the altar of progress or the bottom line. But I can tell you the reason why churches do this, and again, the intent is always not, malicious, right? But the reason why this is done is because when you get a church to be as big as we want a lot of these big top 100 mega churches to be, you can't afford to pay staff at the ratio that you'd pay staff at a smaller church. So, as a consultant, one of the things that we'll teach people often, in churches, you want to have a staff ratio of about 1 full-time equivalent for every 50 people to shepherd them well. Versus it may be 1 to 250, 1 to 300, 1 to 500. The bigger a church gets, the lower that ratio goes, right? And it's hard to find people from their perspective. This is the language that I've heard from being inside these walls and inside these meetings as both a pastor and a consultant, right? We can't find the level of talented staff that we need, which I think is a whole nother problem. But because they think they can't find that level of talent to hire staff, and they don't want to spend that much money, right? Because if you're spending that much money on staffing, the model doesn't work, because statistically, the more people you have in a church and the more you talk about tithing, the less people tithe, right? But if you get a lot of people in, you talk about tithing all the time, you'll have enough, and the system works, if you have enough volunteers. So the system's reliant, as it is right now, on volunteers, but volunteers become expendable because there's usually what's called a volunteer pipeline, which is how can we move this person from space to space to space, and then they become expendable to keep the machine going. And I think that's where the issue really becomes so big, is people are being expended on these altars. And there's another big issue here that we're not talking about a ton, but Christianity has historically been, in all facets, more about what we do for our communities outside of a building
100%.
than what we do inside of a building. And I think there's a shift. I don't know when it happened, but at least in the past few decades that I've been really involved, we talk more about how do you live out your identity of being a child of God? How do you live out your identity of being a believer? We teach much more of living that identity and what you do inside the walls and what you do outside the walls, when there's a world that needs the love of Christ, I think, more than ever. Like, people need love.
Yeah, I mean, listen, hard agree here on all this. I think one of the most detrimental things to happen to the American church is the church growth movement out of the 70s and 80s. This idea of like, hey, whatever you got to do to grow your church is bigger and bigger. It just is such a detriment to how we think about what church is and what church isn't today. And I completely agree. Like, these mega churches become their own entities that need bodies to make everything work, right? And then money gets involved, and then you're thinking about your ministry. And don't forget too, there's a direct link to pastor plants church blows up, pastor believes that God is now blessing the work of the church because the church is big numerically. That is very faulty thinking for a lot of reasons, including the fact that the early church, the idea was smaller and smaller, right? These little communities all over the place was how God, quote unquote, blessed the church, not through huge numbers. So, and then of course you have consumerism, you have the allure of mega church celebrity pastor status, you have the book deals that all come along with that. You have these huge productions, and you have the music industry that is church-based. So there's a lot of layers that feed this, but I agree with everything that you just said. And the result is that people often, not every time, but people end up getting really hurt and become expendable, right? And then your pastor relationship, it's not a pastoral relationship. It's an employee relationship. And once that employee is terminated via their volunteerism, that pastoral ministry is gone.
Yeah.
Right? So it was never really about, ultimately, I care about you as a human. It becomes, I care about you as long as you're valuable to the work of the church. And then once you're not anymore, well, I have other people. I have to fill that space because this job needs to be done. And now I have to pour into that person, so I have no bandwidth to pour into you. And so I think what happens is that, while maybe that's not the intent, that's the impact. And impact matters more than intent. Doesn't matter what your intent is. Agree. If people are getting run over and getting hurt and being thrown off the sides of the machine, then the intent is completely, it doesn't matter. It's the impact. And the impact is that people are getting harmed.
Totally agree, man. And I think that's it. There's a lot of good people in these churches who are doing leadership, who they got into ministry for the right reasons. They didn't set out to hurt people, but they don't recognize when that's what the system is doing, because you don't have time to reflect. Speaking as someone who's in that system as a staff member for a long time, you don't have time to reflect in it. You only have time to keep the machine going, because if you don't keep the machine going and things don't grow, you lose your job, right? But I think it's also why, when you look at some of the biggest churches in the country, the ones that are building the systems for everybody else, right? And I'm not going to name any right now. We've named them in other podcasts. We'll do that. But the 3-4 biggest churches that are writing the systems for everybody else.
Yeah, Elevation, Bethel, Hills. I'll call them out. There you go.
Yeah, Church of the Highlands is the biggest one with systems.
Red Rocks, right? Yes.
But so for instance, Church of the Highlands and their system, a part of what they teach is like one of the reasons why they're able to keep costs so low. They're able to launch campuses and do all that. They're financially healthy as they're teaching pastors. One of the reasons they're able to do that is because their staff costs are low, because they have Highlands College. So because of that, what you've seen is seen this pop up of every big church wants to have their own college now.
Totally.
Right? They want to partner with SCU or something like that.
College.
Exactly. You've got 12 Stone. And I'm not saying, that I'm against 12 Stone Church, but 12 Stone started the residency program. So you got churches that are starting residency programs. All of those things are designed to be a pipeline of leadership, potential staff, volunteers in your church. And while they're in the residency, while they're in the internship, while they're in the college, that is free labor for 3-4 years. 100%. And then most of them don't get hired out. So again, there are some helpful things to it, but the system lends itself toward, we have to consume. And if we looked at our back door and the people running out our back door, I think it would break our hearts. But there's not enough research looking at the back door.
100%.